A very good evening to one and all present here. Welcome to online lecture series brought to you by Intersections, Banaras Hindu University. Intersections B.H.U is an informal academic platform under the aegis of Faculty of Arts, Banaras Hindu University. The purpose of this online lecture series is to address young minds of scholars, academicians, and mostly PG students and bring about an awareness of the recent and ongoing studies in the sphere of academics. Today, we have among us Dr. Muneer A. who is currently working as Assistant Professor in Aligarh Muslim University, Aligarh. His PhD work explores devotional performance narratives in Mappila Muslim literary culture of the Malayalam-speaking South Indian state of Kerala. Having long been intrigued by the relationship between religion and cultural studies, spec- sorry, religion and literature, Sir's interest rests with projects dealing with comparative literary studies and cultural studies, especially the ones involving such languages as English, Arabic, Malayalam, and Urdu. So, without further delay, I, on behalf of Intersections, Banaras Hindu University, welcome you, sir. As for the audience, please, it is requested to keep your mics off throughout and do not share your screen. During the lecture, please drop the questions and in the chat box, which shall be addressed in the question answer session. Once again, I welcome you, sir. Thank you.
Hello. Hello.
Good evening, sir.
Can you hear me?
You are audible, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you for that generous introduction. I'm delighted to be part of this forum that you guys have put together for in the interest of collective learning. I take the opportunity to congratulate my friend Dr. Vivek Singh and all his students on this great initiative, and I hope that this will have a life of its own in the days to come. So I have some difficulty in approaching this this subject, the subject of today's talk, the idea of an anthropology of literature, because to treat a subject like this within the confines of a session like this is the difficulty in doing so is quite apparent. So what I'm going to do is to flag a few points to put on the table some questions that you as students of literature, culture, and largely as students of humanities will find interesting. So I'm going to put on the table some questions, some, broadly speaking, avoiding the specifics, the nuances, the nitty-gritty of the topic, without going into the specifics. What I want to do is to give you an idea of what I have called an anthropology of literature, and I'll be giving a few examples to illustrate my point. In the form of scholarship or research that has been undertaken by scholars in different fields, not only in the field of literature, but also in other fields of in other scholarly areas, and then we'll see what we can kind of take away from such scholarship as we try to study and examine literature, however broadly understood. Now, to begin with, I would like to make a few remarks about the very idea of interdisciplinarity, because the topic that we're dealing with today, in fact, is kind of an effect of what we understand by interdisciplinarity. Now, this has to be clarified in some detail, because these days everybody talks about interdisciplinarity, and the term has become quite fashionable. Everybody is interdisciplinary. No one is a disciplinary person these days. So people have been using this word or term in a rather facile, bland, celebratory, or in an uncritical way. So I just wanted to make a few remarks on that, because this idea is so crucial to the subject, to understanding of the subject that we are dealing with, and I hope that will give us a good entry point to the subject of our discussion. So, anthropology of literature, I'm talking about anthropology of literature as an approach, as a methodology for studying literature, literary cultures, etc. Right. So this is a methodological, preoccupation, or anthropology of literature is not a discipline in the strict sense of the word, but rather it's an approach. An approach you and I, anyone can take to the study of literature, depending on the kind of project that you and I embark on. So it's not in today's world, especially in today's in this age, which is sort of known as interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, or even multidisciplinary in some variously known as going beyond boundaries and disciplinary constraints and so on. It is not unusual for a student of literature or a researcher in the field of literary studies to work with some anthropological sensibilities. Okay, and similarly, it is not unusual or even kind of shocking to hear about an anthropologist who works with a literary sensibility. So, what I'm trying to say is that an approach is a sensibility, the way in which you want to see a particular, to experience, to inhabit in some cases, live in some cases, a certain subject, a certain area, a certain rubric, and so on. So I don't think you guys are surprised, to hear about someone who is working in the field of literature to talk about anthropology, because we are already fallen into interdisciplinarity, right? We're already in the age of the age of post-canon, in the age of, all these are fashionable terms, and we can talk about them, in more detail, maybe if time permits. But in this so-called age of post-canon, post-discipline, and so on, it is not it's not at all surprising that one can find anthropological sensibilities in a literary scholar and literary sensibilities, by the same token, literary sensibilities in an anthropologist. So what do I understand by interdisciplinarity? Let me share that with you, and then we can move on. Like I told you a while ago, I don't understand interdisciplinarity in any bland sense. It is not a panacea for a solution to all the problems that are affecting or gripping our discipline, and by which I mean not just English, broadly understood, literary and cultural studies, because the discipline of English is not just English, as such. A lot of things that we do in the name of English, and English is increasingly becoming a very loose category and a very flexible, as it were, category which encompasses a lot of things, a whole variety of phenomena, a whole variety of practices within its ambit. And therefore, I don't think, none of us are talking about English in a very, narrow sense of the word, because then what is really English about what we are doing? I mean, that's a question that we all want to ask ourselves, because at your own, curriculum, your syllabi, your preoccupations, your research questions, your research projects, and so on. And you will see that English is not really, the defining category, the defining rubric under which your studies could be organized or understood. So, what I'm trying to say is that when we talk about interdisciplinarity, it is not a call for relaxing discipline. To begin with, interdisciplinarity is not that you can take anything from any discipline for whatever reason, just for the sake of it, in a very bland, nonchalant way. The actual questions that you want to ask, and just for the sake of, or for the fun of it. That is not what we mean by interdisciplinarity, kind of crossing borders just for the fun of it. Now, interdisciplinarity means, when you are working within the parameters or the boundaries of a discipline, let's say the discipline of English or English studies for that matter. Again, what is English is a question, and you might want to think about it, if not now, later on, because that's a very important question. Methodologically interesting, pedagogically interesting, and I hope you will all have occasion to reflect on that, or in your own ways. Interdisciplinarity is something that you need or something that you require when you feel that the boundaries of your discipline are not enough or sufficient, okay, or useful for that matter, for doing the kind of work that you want to do, okay. So not just for the sake of it, like you are working on a project. Say you are studying the Qawwali tradition in India, for example, the Qawwali tradition, okay. Or let's say you are studying temple culture, in India. So now you have to see what kind of approach or what kind of methodology will help you to best undertake the research project that you have chosen, you have selected. Right. Now, when you feel that the kind of disciplinary boundaries to which you are subject, for example, can you work on temple culture or folklore for that matter, or like I said, the Qawwali tradition in India, can you work on this within the disciplinary bounds of English as a department, especially when that is defined in a very narrow sense, okay? Then if you realize that your project cannot kind of succeed within these disciplinary bounds, and then you feel a need for crossing the boundaries, that is when the interdisciplinarity happens. Because there is a need that you feel, that you actually realize, right, for crossing borders, for moving from one discipline to another, for bringing various disciplines together. Because there is an intersection. You are working at an intersection. Like the name of your forum is intersection, right? So when you are working at an intersection of disciplines, right? At a point where different kinds of questions emerge, different kinds of sensibilities emerge, different kinds of projects emerge, right? Then you actually need to come up with a methodology or a framework that will help you to do the kind of work that you actually want to do. So I want to begin with this disclaimer that interdisciplinarity cannot be used in any celebratory easy sense of the word, but rather it has to be used very critically and with a sense of need, with a sense of an urgency or immediacy, that you feel that it is kind of urgent for you to cross borders. So the topic that we are dealing with today, anthropology of literature, by which I mean an anthropological approach to the study of literature or an anthropological perspective on literature. This is what I mean by this title, and of course anthropology is a field in its own right, literary study is a field in its own right, and both these disciplines have a lot of internal richness and complexity, and we don't have the time to go into that richness and complexity of each of these disciplines, and that is why my title is The Idea. So the idea of an anthropology of literature is actually about what kind of an anthropological perspective, when and what kind of an anthropological perspective is actually useful for us in our study literature, in the sense that we understand the word after the cultural turn that the discipline has undergone. So we'll come to that in a minute. So when you say anthropology of literature, there are two things. Okay. Is between anthropology and literature, okay, and how much anthropology and how much is in literature. So, for example, if you take the novel, the one I like, most his novel titled An Antique Land. So Aligarh Ghosh is actually a trained anthropologist. He is an anthropologist by profession. If I remember correctly, he is a PhD in anthropology, right? Or he has an advanced degree in anthropology, if not a PhD. Now, so he has written a novel. So this is literature as we understand it. Okay, well, this is not fashion. This is not ritual. This is not folklore. This is literature. But then what he does in the novel is actually reads like an ethnography. Okay, it reads like a depiction of culture. Okay, as such. And it's one could find literature in anthropology and anthropology in literature. I cited the example of Aligarh Ghosh's novel In an Antique Land, which actually makes use of, and he himself is an anthropologist, by training. So, but we know him as a literary, writer, as a novelist. So, in this particular novel that I just mentioned, he actually makes use of ethnographic methods to tell his story. So, what I'm trying to say is that this is not something that that is kind of bizarre or even scandalizing by any means, because there's a lot of traffic going on between anthropology and literature. But that is not what I want to talk about, because as I told you at the very beginning, my interest in this is purely methodological, dealing with the question of how a literary scholar or a researcher or a student can find anthropological methods useful, and also when, because it's not necessary that you need to be an anthropologist, you need to be employing an anthropological perspective, which I will come to in a minute. We are talking about it rather abstractly at the moment, but we'll move on to that point in a minute. So my interest is in understanding how far and also when exactly that an anthropological methodology is useful for the study of literature. Because if you are happy within the confines of the discipline, like if you say no, I don't want any interdisciplinary, flirtations, I am quite happy within the discipline, within the boundaries. I don't have a problem. I want to study Shakespeare. I want to closely read him, and literary study gives me the necessary tools to do that. So I don't need that kind of disciplinarity that you are talking about, and so on. So I'm not saying that. Now, from this moment on, every literary student, literature student has to kind of convert to anthropology. That is not what I am talking about. Rather, I'm using it in very sparingly and a lot of caution, because boundaries are not always bad. Sometimes boundaries also make sense, and the kind of project that it all depends on the kind of research project that you want to do. And that actually determines the kind of methodology that you want to adopt. All right. So this is not a call to abandon literature, or rather to convert to anthropology, but rather to understand how an attention to literature as practice, which I think is one of the crucial, features of anthropology. Studies actual behavior, studies the specifics of sociality, what people do, how they do it, how they live a certain norm, and so on. So that kind of an attention, how that kind of an attention could be usefully mobilized in the study of literature. That is what I am concerned with, not the general question of the relationship between anthropology and literature. That is that is goes plenty, and a lot of things that you can explore there. So, when we talk about anthropology of literature, two terms become paramount, and this is culture and text, right? Culture and text. By the way, please let me know when I am not audible. So my connection is not that good. It's okay. So please let me know. Just we should be embarrassed, both of us. Yeah. So culture and text. Anthropology studies culture, okay, and literature deals with text, right? That is our conventional, or not even conventional, our everyday understanding of, and which I don't think is also wrong, understanding of anthropology and literature. Okay, anthropology studies cultural difference, like how different people they engage in different cultures, how cultures constitute people, and how people constitute culture variously, and so on. So culture is at the center of anthropology. There is no question about that. Of course, what culture means is a bone of contention, not just in anthropology, also in cultural studies, and it has mutated over time. If you go to the roots of the word culture, you will see how the meaning has kind of evolved from cultivation to particular sensibility, to human development, to improvement of the even improvement of the personality, and so on. Like when you say cultivation as a moral virtue or something. So, and so is the idea of text. And text, we in the field of literature, we take text to be the center of attention, okay, in our discipline. Now, what has happened within both these disciplines? How anthropology understands culture has changed. When anthropology was actually influenced by the so-called textual turn, or the literary turn, and B.H.U could be an example to illustrate this point, because he is one of the famous anthropologists who have said that culture should be understood as text, right? And this is an anthropologist talking about culture, right, in terms of literature, right? So, and then there is a wonderful book that you might want to read to understand how the so-called literary or the kind of techniques, the kind of attention that literature actually uses. Literature means the study of literature, not literature per se, of course. The study of literature actually uses what kinds of reading against the grain, hermeneutics of suspicion, looking for not just what the text says, but also what the text doesn't say, and so on. So how has literary study has influenced anthropology? One could understand that influence not only from Yeats. Yeats himself was somebody who loved literature, quite a lot. He has made that quite explicit on various occasions. Even the essay that I refer to, his book, The Interpretation of Cultures, is full of such references. His idea of thick description is also something, as the definition of ethnography is in fact inspired by his interpretive theory of culture. So hermeneutics, or interpretation of the text as we practice it in the discipline of literary studies, becomes very important for an anthropologist too, and therefore Gears argues that culture has to be read as a text, because its culture is, as he famously said, webs of significance, right? That the webs of significance that man has spun himself, right? Man is an animal suspended in the web of significance that he himself has spun. That is what he says. And these webs of significance, so it is full of meaning. Culture is full of meaning, okay? And because it is full of meaning, it is semiotic, right? It is semiotic, and then the task of the anthropologist is to interpret it, to understand it. Okay. There is a way in which we can see here that how culture has become text all of a sudden, right? How culture has become text. Because in the very traditional view of anthropologists about culture was, the whole way of being, the whole way of living. This is Edward, I think Tyler, E.B. Tyler, whose primitive culture offers this definition of culture as a whole way of life. Okay. And anthropologists were quite happy with that definition, because you are studying religion, you are studying ritual, you are studying even fashion and so on, and they were quite happy because this is all part of a whole way of life or being and so on, and more importantly, it was understood to be a stable thing. The meaning was never understood to be something that changes. Hello? The meaning was never. Yeah.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. So this kind of culture becoming text, changes the way anthropologists, looked at culture, and attention to science systems, attention to meaning, and so on, becomes very high on their agenda. But at the same time, there is some kind of culturalizing that is taking place within the discipline of literary studies also, such that what is text? Anything is text, right? Any sign system is text. Anything that has meaning is a sign, and any system of signs can be understood as text, not just the literary text, okay, not just a novel or a play or a poem, but also, ritual. Ritual is a text, okay? Fashion is a text. Food is a text. Food habits and so on. So, we see kind of a mutually constituting process here. That is to say, culture becoming text for anthropologists, and text actually becoming culture for literature students, such that today we are, we have no conjunction in talking about film, talking about folklore, about fashion, about ritual, about a whole lot of things that earlier were considered outside the purview of literary study, because text is not just the printed text, the inscribed text, the written text, and the literature. The word literature, itself undergoes a great semantic shift, or maybe a semantic sea change here, because literature, strictly speaking, means something that is written. But then look at what we actually are doing in the name of literature. What kind of questions are we asking? What kinds of objects we are looking at? Not just the inscribed or written text. So this has to be understood. The moment in the 80s or so, when the cultural turn, I'm not sure of the actual dates and so on, because like Stuart Hall said, the origins, it's actually a discursive formation without any originary moment. There are a lot of things that happened, which made the situation so. So I'm not kind of worried about the dates and all, but the book writing culture came out in the 1980s, if I am correct. So, and we also see that the kind of cultural turn in literary studies, also with the emergence of cultural studies as a discipline in its own right, also changed the way we think about literature. So, textualizing culture and culturalizing text, meaning that text becomes culture, and then culture in turn becomes text, and kind of a revolution, a revolutionary phenomenon takes place in the field, in both fields, changing the contours of both disciplines. Okay. So now, what is an anthropology of literature? Okay. Like I told you a while ago, this is a methodological curiosity, a methodological, maybe even an anxiety, if you can, maybe you can call it an anxiety also. And anxieties are good, by the way. I'm not using it in a very pejorative sense, or in a negative sense for that matter. Some kind of anxieties and insecurities are always good, because that is what propels your research in better and unexpected ways. So I am one for anxieties and insecurities. There is an ontological insecurity, about literature, and there is an ontological insecurity about culture also. We don't know what culture is exactly. A lot of people have talked about it. Someone was mentioning Roland Barthes, in the chat box a while ago. So a lot of people have talked about these things, but then we still suffer from the ontological insecurity about what literature is, how to distinguish literature from non-literature, or like E.B. Hirsch, the philosopher, rather than asking the question of what is literature, one could ask what is in literature, because it's kind the category has undergone an inflation, not deflation, but rather inflation, such that like we noted a while ago, everything is literature, depending on how you look at it. Although this is something that we might find problematic at certain points. Now, I want to propose that this anthropological approach to literature is actually an effect of the cultural turn that we have been talking about. So, this is not an approach in any, pure form or in any monolithic form, but rather I would like to call it an interstitial concept. And even cultural studies is an interstitial discipline, right? Yeah, I would like to call it an interstitial concept, that is a discipline that exists within the cracks, within the small openings that exist inside a particular discipline. Okay, so anthropology of literature is an approach to literature that we can employ, okay, if need be, if our project actually requires us to go beyond, the disciplinary confines of, our subject. Okay, so now what does it mean to say that anthropological approach to literature is helpful in some cases? Okay. So what do we mean by an anthropological approach in this context? Again, I understand that there are a lot of schools within anthropology, divisions. Anthropologists are not all alone in, kind of thinking about their own discipline. So what I'm trying to say is of broad, general nature, not without actually going into the different kinds of debates that are actually taking place within anthropology regarding how anthropologists should study culture, kind of an emic approach, an ethic approach, an insider approach, an outsider approach, and so on. The focus on the everyday, the actual behavior of people, and also the focus on, the normative behavior of people, and the tension between the two, and so on. So there's a lot of debate taking place within anthropology about that. But when I talk about anthropology of literature, when I talk about anthropology of literature, I am only concerned about the general sense of what an anthropology is, without actually going into the specifics or the nuances of what anthropology is, how it is understood by its own practitioners. So here I find Sheldon Pollock's essay that I had circulated useful, because that is this is his introduction to Sheldon Pollock's introduction to his kind of a magnum opus on literary cultures from South Asia. In the introduction to that book, he proposes that when it comes to studying Indian literary cultures, okay, a historical anthropological approach is always useful. Okay, that he urges all of us to take an anthropological hyphenate kind of historical anthropological approach to the study of Indian literary cultures, and by which he means that is to study what literature means to the people who have produced, copied, circulated, consumed, performed, and so on, a literary text or literary tradition for that matter. So what actually people mean by, or what a text means to the people who have created that text, and of course, vice versa. That is what a text actually means to them, and the changes that take place in the meanings of that text. Okay, so meaning that we need to think about literary culture, not just literature per se, but rather literature should be understood as a cultural practice, and therefore literature is a set of practices. And what are these practices? These practices are the production of literature, writing literature, composing literature, hearing literature, okay, copying literature, circulating literature, performing literature, and so on. So these are the practices of a literary culture. So when it comes to studying the practices of literary culture, an anthropological approach to literature is useful. So that is why I said a while ago, by means of caution, that this is not an approach that one should advocate or one should propose as a kind of a solution to all the problems that we face as we try to study literature, but rather it has its own limited purchase, its own traction, and I think this approach is most useful when we actually look at the literary practices or the practices of literary culture. That is to say, what actually people are doing with literature. Okay, the kinds of things that people are doing with literature. What are these kinds of things that people are doing with literature? For example, I think all of you are familiar with these popular Sufi songs, which Richard Eaton talks about in his works. Chakki Nama and Charka Nama, right? Richard Eaton, the historian of South Asian Islam, he talks about Chakki Namas and Charka Namas in the Deccan region of in the South India. So, especially in the B.H.U area. So, Chakki Nama and Charka Nama, these are actually songs these are actually songs that women actually sing. So songs that women sing when they are engaged in household chores or activities. So Chakki Nama meaning the song that women sing while grinding food grains at the grindstone, and Charka Nama, the song that mostly women sing while spinning the wheel and so on. Now, these songs were written by Sufis whose authorship is either unknown or disputed, and there is a reason why the Sufis kind of created these songs. According to Richard Eaton, these songs also were not just kind of meant to give some entertainment or some relief to the women who were engaged in these activities, household activities, like spinning the wheel or grinding food grains, or even Lori Nama, which is lullaby, the rocking kids to sleep and so on. So this was not only intended to give some kind of diversion or some kind of relief or entertainment or pleasure to these women who were engaged in otherwise boring or mundane things. But it had a religious function to serve. Okay. And these songs also, according to Eaton, played a very dominant role in expanding Islam in the Indian subcontinent. So now, how do we study the practices of this literary culture? How do we study Chaki Nama or Charka Nama? Can we study it within an abstract, formalistic, approach, where you understand the text as a domain of symbols, okay, without any bearing on the domain of practice? That is to say, doesn't this literature also influence the way that these people live? And isn't this literature a crucial component, of their very life world? I mean, can you think of these women, without Chakinama or Charkanama, right? I mean, this is also crucial to their own self-understanding of as Muslim, as a subject, and for that matter. So, in order to understand these practices, various practices associated with literature, not just the singing. I mean, production is a factor, consumption is a factor, copying is a factor, circulation is a factor. But in the case of these women, they are singing these songs while they work. Okay, so in this respect, and if we take this to be literature in the broadest sense of the word, how do we study it, and how do we study it within the framework offered by an abstract formalism, words on the page, right? And how do we also study it within an abstract ideologism that, dismissing this as not important? These women are ignorant. They are all traditional. They are all a victim of religion and so on. They don't understand the ideology of it. That approach is also very unhelpful to understand actually the work that is performed by literature on these people. Literature is doing something to these people, okay? And these people are also doing something to literature, because there is a kind of a mutual co-production. What is this mutual co-production? The mutual co-production is that individuals and communities, they produce text. Sufis produced Chaki namas and Charka namas, Lodi namas, Shadi namas, and so on. And various practices associated with this literature, including performance, recitation, and so on, they were very crucial to the makeup of these women, or the community of literature, not just these women. There are a lot of examples to illustrate this point. All right. So we need to pay attention to the kind of the mutual production that is at work here. That is how individuals and communities producing text, and in turn, at the same time, how text constitute individual and community identity. All right. So And this approach is also some influenced by Bakhtin's idea of sociological poetics. In fact, Pollock, I think Bakhtin is somebody who has influenced Pollock also, because what he talks about is all can be found in Pollock's work also. So I'm talking about this methodology that Pollock puts forth, not about the kind of work that Pollock has done, and people will have a lot of disagreements about it. And that is also okay. But it is also okay to listen to Pollock rather than dismiss him, as good for nothing. It is important for us to, first of all, to listen to not only to Pollock but also to people who think Pollock's ideas are, absurd. So I'm not interested in the politics of this. I'm also not interested in the controversy surrounding, Indologists. My interest is in trying to understand what this particular methodology that Pollock proposes, how far that is helpful in the study of literary cultures. And this is something that, especially, this anthropological, historical anthropological approach, or a sociological poetics, as Bakhtin would call it. If we recall the opening paragraph of Bakhtin's famous essay in dialogic imagination, the discourse in the novel, he opens that by alluding, by gesturing towards the sociological poetics that he has in mind. He says, I quote him, form and content in discourse are one. Once we understand that verbal discourse is a social phenomenon, discourse, verbal art, literature, novel, and so on, it's a social phenomenon, social throughout its entire range and each and every of its factors, from the sound image to the furthest reaches of abstract meaning, unquote. So, how do we capture, as researchers, as students of literature, as students of culture, right? How do we capture the social life, the social production, the social embeddedness of literary cultures? And I think that we need to take seriously what actually people do with literature that they have produced, because that is when we understand the power of literature, not only the power of literature, but also the actual sociality of people, people who have produced it, because this literature is something that punctuates their daily life, something that is crucial to their makeup, their subjectivity, their ethical, in some cases ethical, makeup, right? And one needs to take into account these performative dimensions, these practices of literary culture while studying literary cultures that have these dimensions. I'm not saying this approach should be taken up in all kinds of work that we do. No, depending on the kind of work that we do. And I personally feel in my own work on the devotional performance genres, from the literary culture of the Mappila Muslims of Kerala, I have found this attention to the practices of literary culture is actually useful analytically and also descriptively and analytically both, because that is when you are able to describe this literature better and also to analyze this literature better. So I think I'll stop there, and if I have missed out on anything, you could draw my attention to that. And I'm neither an anthropologist nor a great scholar of literature, so my understanding of the subject is limited to my own very modest work on the subject that I have just mentioned. So I think, and there are three examples that I would recommend to all of you, which could probably illustrate the point that I have made better, and which, for the want of time, I wouldn't go into. So these three examples. One is a very interesting ethnography of poetry by a Harvard anthropologist, Stephen Caton. Stephen Caton, his ethnography of Yemeni tribal poetry in Arabic. Yemeni tribal poetry is very, very interesting, because it illustrates the significance of poetry in Yemeni society by exploring, what kinds of uses are actually people making of this poetry, like how poetry is used in weddings, in war mediations, in political discourse, and so on. So the title of this book is Peaks of Yemen I Summon. Peaks of Yemen I Summon, Poetry as Cultural Practice in a North Yemeni Tribe. This is an anthropological work done by an anthropologist, but this is an anthropology of poetics, an ethnography of poetry. Okay. The second book is a book by Priya Joshi, which came out in 2002. This is about a familiar topic, a topic that is familiar to all of us, because we all have studied the Indian English, fiction. This Priya Joshi's book, interestingly, looks at the making of the English novel in India, employing the methodology of a sociology of reading. Kind of, she's looking at the readerly practices. We talked about practices, right? Practices of literature, right? How people read, what people read, when people read, and so on, right? How they consume literature, how they produce literature. So this book is also interesting from that perspective. And the title of this book is In Another Country, Colonialism, Culture, and the English Novel in India. So this is by Priya Joshi. She looks at the what kinds of fiction that Indians consumed during the colonial period in the 19th century and so on. The third book, again very fascinating, is by a historian from the Michigan University. Her name is Farina Mir, and the title of her book is The Social Space of Language, Vernacular Culture in British Colonial Punjab. So this book also is a rich cultural history of the popular Punjabi Qissa tradition, which is a vibrant, which is partly romance and partly epics. So she interestingly looks at what actually people do with this literary culture, the literary tradition. And it is in this respect that the book has interest for us. So I'll stop there, and I apologize that there was a professor who intervened, and I couldn't recognize him, who had made some comments during my talk, and and then someone had commented in response to that he was a professor. So I apologize for that, and uh, yeah. So I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for that engaging talk of yours. Now, I would actually invite Vivek sir to take over and have an interaction with you so that we can delve and talk and learn more about this topic. Over to you, sir. Good evening. So please unmute yourself, sir.
Before I start and engage with Muneer, if Irfan is here, may I request Irfan to give your views, because you also have a specialty into these fields and like you know much about interdisciplinarity like Muneer. So could you please share some
Yeah,
ideas?
unlike Irfan, I am not an expert.
No, before I could say, no, Munir, you are definitely ahead of me. I don't know whether I am one or not. I just just because I've done a PhD that tries to bridge sociology and literature doesn't necessarily imply that I happen to be an expert. I don't think I'll be able to sort of attend to each and every aspect that Munir so eloquently drew our attention to. I'll just maybe for the discussion, subsequent discussion, what I can perhaps, in my own humble understanding, what I can perhaps flag is, and this is not really a response. I don't think I am to pose comments or questions here. I think although Munir has in a very academic and sophisticated way drawn our attention to some of the important concerns, particularly in relation to interdisciplinarity, but if I were to, take it to further simplify it, I think what he's perhaps trying to draw our attention to, and I consider myself a student of literature, in that regard, literature and society. I think what he's trying to particularly emphasize on while discussing anthropology of literature is that, end of the day, as students, as researchers, as scholars, as curious minds, we need to perhaps attend to the centrality of observation. And the centrality of observation is exceedingly critical, not just, I mean, of course, here we are discussing literature in particular, but I think in social sciences and humanities in general, there's no way one could do away with observation. I think there's something exceptionally crucial about observation. So whether we are talking about, so for instance, when Munir was talking about Amitav Ghosh's In an Antique Land, one thing that immediately struck me was that the work remains extraordinary because of this incredible observation on the part of Ghosh. So Ghosh is an extraordinary writer, for that matter, any other writer, and I'm sure people who are part of this conversation can enlighten me on this. But it goes without saying that any great writer or any great piece of work is essentially, whether in sociology or anthropology or literature, or any other discipline within social sciences, humanities, I think any great, credible, touching, hope-affirming work is a result of earnest observation. So, and it is only through observation that I suppose we can perhaps make sense of what Munir, in a very, very, again, eloquent way, was trying to draw our attention to. So a great work, a great poem, a great sociology piece, anthropological reflection, a wonderful ethnography, all of it essentially goes back to observation. So in some senses, and this is something that we also used to discuss back in Aligarh, when I was there, that literature in some senses tries to train us in observation. I think one of the things that literature definitely does, and I suppose I shouldn't say this, it's blasphemous on my part because I'm speaking from sociology, from Department of Sociology, but I still believe that literature, I think, does more in that respect as compared to sociology. Definitely sociology. I can't speak on anthropology particularly. So literature trains us in observation, and I think as students we should think about the crucial, the crucial role that it plays. And once that is taken care of, then I think we begin to understand the anthropology of literature in multiple ways. And lastly, because Muneer talked about Sheldon Pollock at length, and there is in the chat box, of course, there's a response, and it's a very informed response. I'm sure Muneer will attend to this, but I also want to, earnestly make this appeal that very often when we are discussing a great writer, and Sheldon Pollock is an institution. The man has actually created an entire generation of extraordinary scholars working on particularly ancient South Asia, the Cosmopolis, etc. So every time we are talking about a response to Sheldon Pollock, I think what, again, as students, what we can perhaps think about is that let's read Sheldon Pollock first, right? And I suppose, intellectually speaking, and there's nothing arrogant about it, I think we have the intellectual wherewithals to be able to understand what Pollock is up to. I don't think we need any other person to tell us where exactly Pollock is mistaken. So we read Pollock, because Pollock has been controversial for some time now. But so we read Sheldon Pollock, and we read as thoroughly, as sincerely as we can, and then we make sense. This is something that I was also discussing when I was speaking earlier this week. And then, of course, we read Rajiv Malhotra as well. But what I'm perhaps trying to point out is that it will be a little, I would say, it will be a little hasty on our part to dismiss Pollock because there exists a detailed critique of Pollock. So we read Pollock and we read Rajiv Malhotra, and as students, we are very much in a position to make sense of, what's the credibility of Pollock's arguments and what is the credibility of Rajiv Malhotra's rebuttal. Muneer already pointed this out, but I just wanted to flag that once again. Thank you.
Okay, Muneer. Muneer, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll start with the basics because I just took
don't be tough.
We have students from PG who are going for research, and there are people who are trying for research. So let's say, for example, that how do you address this question when in the department called English department, when there are students who are going with a proposal on PhD not on so-called text, right? Let's say, for example, printed words on pages in English. So they are directly dismissed by saying that what are you doing here? You are supposed to approach sociology department, you are supposed to approach anthropology department. So generally they get discouraged, and then they tend to think that the kind of topic they have chosen, let's say, for example, performance studies, or let's say culture in Banaras. So how do you, what is the response on these kind of problems that they face?
Okay. Okay.
Yes, yes. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, Vivek. Oh, okay. Thank you, Vivek, for that question. This is a question that has been haunting all of us, not just since we started teaching, but even right from the time that we entered into research and so on. So I think I would call for this is not just for the students, it's also, I would say this is a question that is addressed to the professors of English or literature. And by professor, I don't mean the person who teaches English, but rather a person who makes a claim for English, right? Who professes literature. right? And this is the title of a book by Gerald Graff, Professing Literature. So I borrow that phrase from him. So all of us, because there are a lot of stakeholders, not just our students, but also us. More importantly, as teachers, as practitioners, our both students and us, we are all practitioners of this literature, and then readers, who read us, who respond to us. These are all stakeholders in this exercise, or in this field, as it were. So this is a problematic in the sense that this is a question that is challenging, but it also opens up various possibilities. So I was talking about in my talk on the logical insecurity, right? I think the heart of the problem is this obsession with the ontology of literature, meaning that ontology, to put it very simply, what is literature? Okay, and the ontological insecurity is, after all, what is literature? We have no idea, or what is English for that matter? Because I also mentioned this in my talk. We are all students of English, and sometimes we say students of English literature. At times we say students of English studies, right? Also to bring in some other stuff like ELT and whatever. So now we should begin ruminating over the very word English. So there are two things here: English literature, and these two categories, they need to be unpacked. These are, of course, constructions. I mean, anyone who is familiar with the history of English studies, both in India and in England, Terry Eagleton has written about that. The rise of English, and Gauri Vishwanathan's The Mask of Conquest. So people are familiar with that. So anybody who is familiar with this history will know that these are all kind of constructions. These are not natural categories. Even literature, for that matter, and also English, right? So for me, both of these categories are at stake here. That is to say, not only just English, not only just the literature, but also what exactly English is. So I've been wondering what is actually English about our English. What is English about our English? Because in a sense, everything is English. And in another sense, like nothing is English. Because all that you need to do is to translate. Okay, you want to do Premchand, Urdu, Hindi, or you want to do Waita Muhammad Bashir from Kerala, Malayali writer, right? You want to do a lot of other people. So now all that you need to do is to translate Bashir into English, or to translate Premchand into English, and then say that I'm working on Premchand, and the question that sometimes professors of English ask about whether it is English or not, I think the question should be asked first to teachers, the practitioners, the people who kind of set the terms for our discipline, because they are also not sure as to what English is, and depending on their predilections, they would say that okay, this could qualify as English project, or this can't qualify as English project. So the point is, we should begin with English. English for me personally, this is a personal reflection, observation. It's an amorphous, ambiguous term. It's not clear to me what is English. What is English about English in India? Because look at the things that we are doing within the Department of English, in the name of English literature or whatnot, right? A whole lot of things. People have people have no qualms about talking about films, comic strips, cartoons, right? Passion, food, rituals, and so on, right? So, what is literature has undergone several mutations, and I think it's good. A disciplinary concern, anxiety is good to a certain extent, okay, because that will also help prevent us from making unnecessary, unnecessary, what should I say, crossing. Because, as I said in my talk, one needn't cross borders just for the fun of it. Okay, one should cross borders only when one actually feels to do so, given the nature of his or her work. So, English is an ambiguous term here, amorphous. We actually don't know what it means. We can say something for the sake of argument, but if you really think about it, look at the projects that we do. Look at the research projects that our students undertake. Okay, there is Urdu there is Malayalam there is all kinds of vernacular traditions there, and then you say, oh, you have translated into English. In that case, everything is English. The only thing that you need to do is to translate it into English. So that for me doesn't make any sense. So then the second part is literature. And what is literature? That question becomes very paramount. Okay, and we kind of talked about that briefly when we said that the term has also undergone several mutations, right? Literature, as we all know, in the modern sense of the word, literature as creative, imaginative writing is a very recent vintage. It is not an old, sense of the word. In fact, if you look at the etymology of the word, we will see that all kinds of writings, or in some cases, all valuable writing, whether it is philosophy, history, or poetry. Even the term was not in use. I mean, even if you look at the very etymology of the word Sahitya, although I am not a Sanskrit scholar, and so my knowledge of it is limited to secondary material. So Sahitya in Malayalam also we use the word Sahityam, right? And if you look at the etymology of the word, it is like Sahid. Sahid is so crucial to it, right? Sahid means together. Sahityam or Sahitya, or in Arabic the term is adab, which later was also used by which is also used in Urdu, in Hindustani. So Sahid, like the etymological meaning of Sahitya, does not actually include what we today understand, very narrowly to be imaginative and creative writing, but rather the performative dimension of Sahitya was actually apparent, actually was inherent in the very term Sahitya, because something that is done together, Sahitya, right? Something that is done together. It stands collected, of course. So then the performative dimensions, and more importantly, Indian literary cultures are performative in nature. I mean, if you look at Indian literary cultures, performative dimensions are quite obvious. They all exist in performative context. Okay, so the actual, I mean, you see the recitation of Ramayana, Rama story, and so on for religious purposes, reading scriptures, which are also considered, kind of literary works, and so on. So this reading, recitation, performance, this is so crucial to Indian literary culture, not just to one particular religious community, but all kinds of religious community. So I think we should take that sense seriously. Sahid. The Sahid in Sahitya should be. Sahidam, in Malayalam we use the word Sahidam. Sahidam. Kisi ke saath. Together. And so on. So that Sahidam, the Sahidam in Sahitya has to be taken seriously, and therefore one shouldn't be obsessed with the romantic definition of literature, the narrow sense of literature, as creative, imaginative writing, because we know that it's a historical, it has an historical contingency. It emerged at a particular point in the history of literature, the career of literature, and that is with the Romantic movement. Right. Emerson talks about it in his essay, The Rise of English. Okay, so I think in a sense we are going back to the older notions, older senses of the word literature, whereas literature is all kinds of texts that have meaning. So I know this is problematic from a disciplinary point of view, but what I would like to say in response to your question, because you are also looking for a practical, practical answer, not just academic mumbo jumbo. So we are also looking at some practical. So what I would say, I would say is that I think we should allow students to work with not only with the narrow sense of literature, but also with the expanded sense of literature. So that doesn't mean that we are abandoning Shakespeare, for ritual or for fashion. Well, people could research on Shakespeare or on canonical literature, on various kinds of literary cultures and so on. But if somebody within the English department also wants to work on, let's say, in the area of cultural studies, wants to work on food culture for that matter, I think the discipline of English will not actually lose out on anything if we allow the candidate to work on that topic, because she or he will be using the techniques, the methodologies, the rubrics, the frameworks, the vocabulary that discipline of English has offered them. So using, when anthropologists make use of literature, right? They are not abandoning anthropology. They are actually making use of literary techniques in their study of, anthropological subjects. So the same can be done by us without, being defensive or unnecessarily territorial about it. I don't think that helps neither us nor the discipline. Okay, thank you. Yes, come.
So Muneer, do you think we can take for 10 to 15 minutes, or shall we close it?
Yeah, there were a couple of questions in the chat box. So
no, they are just observation. Okay. Pragya.
Okay. No. Okay, no.
Pragya.
Okay.
Can you ask me a question?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So there are just couple of questions. I'll merge them and ask it to you. It's like, sir, do you think that all subjects are inherently interdisciplinary? And if we look at anthropology as an approach or a method to analyze literature, then can anthropology be grouped among other approaches of literature like historicism and new criticism?
Yeah, good question. Great question. The second question was about anthropology, right? Anthropology using
approach as a method to analyze anthropology as an approach or method to analyze literature. So, can anthropology be grouped among other approaches to literature like historicism and new criticism?
Great question. That's a great question. Um, yeah. First of all disciplines are interdisciplinary. That's a very good observation in the sense that, like I mentioned in my talk, every discipline has is anxiogenic. Anxiogenic means it has its own anxieties. Alright. We are all anxious. And it's not just disciplines. And just think about ourselves. Do we really know who we are? For example, if I were asked, like who actually I am, then would I be able to answer that question successfully in any complete sense? So this ontological insecurity, or this anxiety about who we are, like I am a Muslim, or I am a Hindu, I am a Christian, I am an Indian, I am a man, I am a woman, I am a South Indian, a North Indian, Pakistani, and so on and so forth. So are we actually sure about these things? Right? Because there is an anxiety about who is an Indian. I mean, that's politically very loaded these days. Who is an Indian? And who can be Indian? Who cannot be Indian, and so on and so forth. So it's not just about disciplines. I think it is part and parcel of the human condition also. Because this ontological insecurity as to what we are and who we are. Okay. Identity is always problematic, and therefore it's interesting that Pragya said that or asked rather whether every discipline could be interdisciplinary. I think every discipline has an interstitial space. Remember that phrase that I used? Interstitial space. The discipline as such, like if you look at a discipline as such, you have certain tendencies, certain protocols. For example, dance cannot be studied and so on within English departments, or some performance tradition and so on. But the very same discipline also leaves open the possibility, for taking in, for embracing things that are traditionally not considered to be part of it. So, in that sense, I would say every discipline is interdiscipline, or rather, I mean, the terminological necessities are not very important because one could go on and on talking about this, and whether English is a discipline or an interdiscipline or even anti-discipline for that matter, or even post-discipline for that matter. So these are also in some cases hasty nomenclatures, sometimes used very thoughtlessly, without exercising any caution. So this terminological jugglery is not always important, but then the point about interdiscipline is important because any discipline has its own facts, its own, as Derrida would say, its own aporias, its own dead ends. So that also make newer work possible, newer things possible, and that allows us to see the discipline in newer ways. So I think that's a great remark. Your remark about interdisciplinarity. Now the second question is about whether anthropology could be considered as an approach within the critical vocabulary of the discipline of English. That's also a great question because we already have this cultural poetics, something that has been influenced by the kind of work that I mentioned in my talk. For example, Bhakti in sociological poetics, That is to say, to study poetry or literature in its social, dimensions as a sociological phenomenon and so on, not just as abstract set of, signs or symbols. So new historicism, I would say, although that's also been subject to, everything is subject to criticism. So new historicism is, I think, closer to what we today mean by anthropology of literature, because what new criticism, not new criticism, which is actually the arch enemy of the approach that we are talking about, because it has its own exclusive focus on text, understood very hermetically, very in a more authoric, autonomous, fashion. So new historicism would be closer to what we call an anthropology of literature. So, because it is focusing on cultural poetics, the famous definition of new historicism as the textuality of history and the historicity of text, right? So it acknowledges that every literary text is situated, okay, and therefore we need to understand literature in its time and place. So, and Greenblatt, Stephen Greenblatt, the proponent of new historicism, who himself is influenced by, I think, Geertz' idea of thick description, his idea of the interpretive theory of culture. So there's a lot of traffic, a lot of give and take between these two approaches. Yeah.
So the next question, there are actually two questions here. It says, when you use the term interdisciplinary, which is in a sense anti-disciplinary, a word that seems to dismantle the binary of self and other, example when we use anthropology in the discipline of literary studies, we cannot categorize literature as the self and anthropology as the other. So how do you conceptualize these terms? At the same time, we can't completely dispense with the binary of self and the other. So please, if you could, elaborate on this.
Yeah, that's a very theoretically loaded, informed question. Remember, I began my talk by saying that we shouldn't celebrate interdisciplinarity, just for the sake of it.
Muneer.
That is to say, yeah, I think my son is like disturbing.
No, it's clear. I was just saying that there is another question, so I will just try to be very quick. Thank you.
Yeah, partly I have answered that question in response to Pragya's question. Now, is it a terminological, debate? Or is it a matter of terminology? Like, for example, shall we call something a discipline or interdiscipline or anti-discipline or even post-discipline? Right. I think simply for the sake of dropping names, it is not helpful. But however, I think every discipline is taught within this binary. Okay, so just as something is a discipline, it is also an anti-discipline, in the sense that the very discipline also, if you talk about it in a very Derridean terms, okay, that will sound very, 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 obfuscating or very obscure. But the question is such that I can't, avoid such vocabulary. So, for example, take comparative literature. So there is a widespread debates going on in the field that whether comparative literature is discipline or interdiscipline or anti-discipline and so on. Okay, so my question would be, what is the analytical value of saying that something is a discipline or under discipline? Now, whatever you call it, that thing or that object always contains within it the traces of other, terms that are excluded. So, disciplines are interdisciplines, and at the same time they are anti-disciplines. Yeah.
So the next question is, can the Darwinian concepts like survival of the fittest or natural inheritance in context to Herbert's social Darwinism be held responsible for Western project of colonization? Do the concepts also not contradict the Sartrean notion of being for itself and also help the colonizers to enter into the cocoon of Sartrean bad faith in order to avoid any moral responsibility of colonizing mission? Am I audible, sir?
Yeah. Anything else?
No, sir, that's it. So, thank
No, no, I think you did not listen to the last question, Pragya.
Oh, yes, sir. Sir, I'm repeating the last question.
Could you repeat the question? I
Can the Darwinian concepts like survival of the fittest or natural inheritance in context to Herbert's